Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Arsenal Pass. Today, I'm joined by Brodie Spurlock once again to talk about the hero that he top-8'd the Pro Tour with, and I think the sort of best deck in the room, even though it didn't win the tournament. Interestingly enough, going into Road to National season, looking at the Calling Antwerp coming up, does look like Lexi is the most dominant deck in the meta. I know we had some strong performances from both Dramai and Oldhim, but if you're looking for a streamlined aggro deck that kind of just has good matchups against everything, Lexi really is that deck. So, Brodie, you sort of famously switched prior to the Pro Tour from Azalea over onto Lexi. Talk to me a little bit about what prompted that switch and why you think Lexi is in such a good position right now.
Yeah, so I think starting with why I switched off of Azalea, I think both decks are super strong, and Azalea is obviously incredibly powerful. But I think that Azalea has some really difficult matchups, primarily being like Big Dragon Dromai and Fatigue Golden. And I think it's really hard to change your Azalea deck to be anywhere close to favored in those matchups. I think that they're basically just kind of like a brick wall that if you ever run into them in your tournament, especially in top cut, they're almost definitely just going to end your tournament right there. And so that's my reason for not bringing Azalea to the Pro Tour, even though I still think she's a top tier choice. And then Lexi, I think, has game into everyone, like a better overall matchup spread. And yeah, like you mentioned, just like one of the strongest decks in the room straight up. So many power cards, so many reasons to be playing that hero right now.
So, what are some of the weaknesses of the Lexi deck? Are there any matchups that you're trying to sort of dodge specifically?
I don't think that there's any horrible matchup. I think that you have game into all of them, but I do think some are harder than others. I know the Uzuri deck is one that people were bringing to the Pro Tour, maybe trying to target Lexi. I don't have a much experience at all into it myself, but like the deck Tao Tao was playing, I think maybe is supposed to be a counter to Lexi, so that's something to look out for, and I'll be curious to test that and see what that matchup looks like.
Okay, so looking high level at your list specifically, I know that when we look at the Lexi list that were represented at the Pro Tour, there was definitely a spread in terms of ice tech that these lists brought. Your list and your team's list does look to sort of favor that a bit more, having the chilling ice veins in the actual deck. Talk to me sort of about that sort of philosophy in Lexi and why some have moved to the completely fused list, and now, sort of post that, you guys have potentially moved back towards adding a little bit more ice into the deck.
Yeah, so I think the argument to be more fuseless is that it is better into Oldhim and better into these slower, more defensive decks where you're not looking to disrupt them as much. You're just trying to present as much damage as possible and go for big turns. Which our deck is still trying to do that, but it has this sort of, you could call it a transformative sideboard package almost, where we still have these, for me, it's like 8 non-blue ice cards that come in versus aggro decks to like interact with them and strip their hand and never let them get these big power turns, ideally. So yeah, that's like the reason why you would go fuseless, and we're still trying to do some of that, but we tried to find a balance where like most of the sideboard space is dedicated to still having an ice package, because I think that some of the ice cards really give you huge percentage points. Like Arctic Incarceration can be so strong into, especially heroes like Azalea, where their deck is mostly reds. So we definitely like wanted to find a way to fit those in.
Mhm. Let's talk about some of the matchups that people picking up this deck might have a little bit of trouble with. So, namely, I would look at Oldhim first. I think traditionally people would see the Oldhim Lexi matchup and assume Lexi would get fatigued, but of course, post Outsiders, maybe not the scenario anymore. And I know that Dramai and Top8 Dramai can be a little bit of a tough matchup. I know you had 2 matches against Mara Farah specifically. Talk to me a little bit about how that matchup goes and how your strategy with this deck beats the Oldhim matchup and the sort of aggro Dramai matchup, or just Dramai in general.
Yeah, so we can start with Oldhim. I think fatigue is definitely a real thing that can happen, and I think that if you're going to play Lexi, getting reps into Oldhim to kind of understand how that matchup plays and understand how to beat fatigue is one of the first things you should be spending your time on. But I do think that it is Lexi favored ultimately. I think there's different builds of Oldhim that can make it harder for the Lexi. I think there's different strategies that Oldhim can take. And honestly, I'm still trying to figure that matchup out because I feel like there's so many different ways it can play.
Hmm.
Um, but the biggest piece of advice there is just get reps into it. I think like after several games, you really start to understand like how you need to be setting up bigger hands and like strategies that you can use to make sure you aren't getting fatigued. A big thing is just utilize Lexi's double arsenal to get 6 card hands and really go over the top. And then for Dromai, I think that first, like managing dragons is really important and understanding when to kill dragons. Um, and I think it's like one of the harder things to figure out in Flesh and Blood, something that I'm still trying to learn.
Hmm.
But Endless Arrow is a really key card in that matchup. If your opponent has, 2 to 3 non-Ashwing dragons in play, a turn of just like pitch a blue, Voltaire Endless Arrow into 2 dragons and then arsenal it, you get like so much free value. It's basically just a snatch that draws a snatch and then you do it again. So that's a key card that particularly shines in that matchup. And then, yeah, I think just like identifying at what point in the game you have to start punching the Dromai's face instead of the dragons. I think that is usually quite late. Like, you don't want to do that until you're stripping basically their whole hand and forcing them into a state where they're like going to be locked for a couple turns and then you kill them. Um, I think that the ice cards are something to play with there. Like, Mars deck plays a lot of reds. So it's possible that Arctic Incarceration could really shine versus her. That's something that I was trying in the Pro Tour. Um, so yeah, Endless Arrow is the biggest card to look out for there, and then just learning Dragon Management is the biggest part of that matchup.
Yeah, I think a heuristic, just like a super high level heuristic, is it's generally later than you think that you will be going face against a Dromai player, and ignoring the dragons. Speaking of sort of key cards, just looking at your equipment suite here, which is Bullseye Bracers, Fandel Spring Tunic, New Horizon, Quiver, Rusting Leaves, Snapdragon Skillers, and Voltaire, of course. I did see some Lexis in the Pro Tour play the Quiver of Abyssal Depths, I think specifically for that Oldhim matchup to try to sort of mitigate fatigue. Do you feel like that card specifically is unnecessary?
So that's one card that I had in my deck for most of testing, and my teammate Andrew did end up registering it. He also made the top 8, and I think that it is something that can help if like Oldhim is fatiguing you. It puts more threats back in your deck. Sometimes the shuffle effect on it is actually the most helpful part, surprisingly. Like sometimes your second cycle will be clunky and just like refreshing it with a shuffle can actually be quite nice. So I definitely think that that card does give you some percentage points if you include it in your deck. I think, but I ultimately felt on the last day that it just like didn't increase my percentage to win that matchup enough to justify the slot in the sideboard, and so that's why I'm only on Rustling Leaves.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's go look at sort of the core deck here. I'm going to read it out. It's going to be 9 Bolton Shot, 3 Chilling Ice Vein, 3 Drill Shot, 3 Endless Arrow, 3 Falcon Wing, 3 Heat Seeker. We'll just talk about the reds first. 3 Infecting Shot, 3 Remorseless, 3 Searing Shot, 1 Sick'em Shot, and then 3 of a kind. One card I want to sort of highlight because I think that the power level sort of gets overlooked a bit is Drill Shot. We did see Drill Shot do a lot of work against these Oldhim decks and just in general in the Pro Tour. Can you talk to me a little bit about the best use cases for that card specifically?
Yeah, so Drill Shot's like number one incredible use case is, of course, putting a -1 counter on Rampart of the Ram's Head if that's the shield Oldhim chooses to play versus you. Um, Most of the time, they're going to try to stop it from hitting, so that doesn't happen, of course. But other than that, just basically Drill Shot forcing your opponent to block it or spend the last of their armor so that it doesn't have an on hit. Um, it's just another essentially must block because like Lexi has so many powerful like 4 and 5 breakpoints with must block on hits that it's pretty important to save their armor for those. So drill shot can be pretty awkward and usually just taking like a 3 block and 1 armor piece is great for you. You're just happy that your arrow is taking armor from them. I think it's actually really interesting to compare drill shot to searing shot because in a vacuum, putting a -1 counter on their equipment is better than them just losing a life. You took away like the utility of them being able to block with their equipment. But there are situations where all of their equipment is gone, and so having one damage on hit is better. So it's kind of interesting, like as the game goes on, and this is something that comes up a lot with Codex of Frailty, like choosing a target.
Hmm.
You have to evaluate whether drill shot or searing shot is going to be worth more. And sometimes it's like all the equipment they have left is just like 2/1 blocks. So it's like if I get drill shot, they don't actually have to block it out entirely. They just have to throw their 2 equipment and they can take the rest of the damage. Versus searing shot, they have to give me a card from hand. So yeah, just like an interesting decision that comes up sometimes.
Yeah, I know we saw it happen in the Pro Tour, but the thing about drill shot is I do think that most old teams and very good old teams will play around it. And it's going to be unlikely that you're just going to hit sort of a vanilla drill shot. But with when you play the bigger sort of the bigger hands in Lexi and you're able to utilize Codex of Frailty potentially in the end of that combat chain to grab the drill shot. I mean, we saw it in Michael Fang's game specifically. Literally just could not play around it, and then you do get that -1 on the Ram's head. Just a very powerful card if you're on a very grindy matchup against Oldham, who's getting a lot of value out of that shield specifically. All right, well, Brodie, we can't talk about Lexi without talking about Three of a Kind. Obviously, one of the most powerful cards of the deck. I sort of had a bit of a paradigm shift over the weekend. Let me know if you agree with it. But Michael Fang was talking to me and said, Three of a Kind, you don't have 3 7 to 8 guard hands with Lexi. What you have is you have 3 carrion husks in the deck without blood debt. So primarily used as a way to block with a couple cards on your opponent's turn. Then we go to your turn. You play your Three of the Kind potentially off Tunic, and you still have a very, very good turn on the crackback. Is that the use case you see for it as well?
Yeah, I really like Michael's description of having 3 carrion husks. I think that's pretty much what it ends up being a lot of the time. Um, Three of a Kind basically refills 2 cards in your hand for free. So in some matchups, like specifically if you're getting fatigued by Oldham, you're trying to go really huge with your Three of a Kind and create a massive turn, in which case maybe you're keeping your whole hand. But usually its use is exactly that. It's like blocking with some cards and then just refilling your hand, and you're not necessarily trying to go uh, over the top with like an enormous power turn. It's just like a value card where uh, you're literally just spending 1 card to draw 3 and a resource, of course. But yeah.
Yeah, and speaking to exceptions to that rule, if we talk about rain razors in the deck, I do think that if you do draw the rain razors with the Three of the Kind, you're looking at potentially not do that, right? If you're able to go wider than you usually can by utilizing something like Snapdragon Scalers, or just potentially you have enough go again, you've drawn the Falcon Wings, then yes, you might go for the 7 or 8 card hands and get that big explosive turn. But Brodie, would you limit sort of that thought process to when you do draw both at the same time? You do get both the Three of the Kind and the Rain Razors?
Yeah, for the most part, I would say so. My deck also has Artivores in
Mm-hmm.
it, so like when you draw either of these, you can call them Anthem effects, then you're more incentivized to keep more cards and really try to go wide. And like you mentioned, Snapdragon Scalers and also the Bullseye Bracers, that's the main time those cards come into use is on these Three of a Kind turns when you keep a bigger hand and have like 3 or more red arrows in hand that you're trying to get them all out in the same turn.
Yeah, I want to talk about Artivore specifically because sort of a historically powerful, aggressive card, especially in decks that like to go wide. But we've seen quite a dichotomy in terms of the lists that play it and that don't. We saw, honestly, I think we saw most Lexi lists not playing Artivore. Talk to me a little bit about why it's in your list and how your team landed on Artivore specifically.
Yeah, so it's an interesting card, like discussing whether to include it or not. It's something that gets worse the more ice cards you have, so I think it makes more sense with the lists that are like leaning toward fuseless. And so it's something that gets sideboarded out of my deck a lot if I'm bringing in all of the ice cards, just because it's difficult to play Artivore without a really high count of attack action cards, of course. Just because you need that attack action card to banish. You don't want to be drawing Artivore with a ton of Winter's Bites, and then it's just kind of this like clunky yellow no block. So I do think that it can be awkward and it's not always in, but I think in the matchups where you're not playing the ice cards and your deck is mostly comprised of arrows, it's a really strong power card to go over the top. It can help kind of quote unquote damage stack these huge turns versus Oldhim, and specifically like when paired with Three of a Kind or something, if you can get 4 or 5 arrows in the same turn, like Artivore um, ends up providing insane value.
Mm-hmm. All right, and now a card in your list that I believe doesn't get talked about enough. That's going to be Codex of Frailty. For the people that don't know how to play this card, what it actually does, because what Codex of Frailty does in a game of Flesh and Blood is not necessarily what it says on the text. Talk to people about sort of the best play patterns for Codex of Frailty and how to utilize it in the Lexi deck.
Yeah, so Codex is best used. First of all, one thing that comes up in Lexi is you don't really want another face-up arrow in your arsenal when you play Codex. Ideally, it is coming from your arsenal as like the last card in your whole hand and arsenal combined, or it's coming from your hand and your arsenal's empty. And the reason for that is when you first of all, you want to play it on an empty hand because, of course, when you get the attack action back, if your hand is empty, you don't have to discard. And then you don't want another arrow specifically in your arsenal when you play it, assuming you can't use that arrow that turn, because oftentimes when you draw off of Ponder, the most likely thing that you're going to draw in the Lexi deck is another arrow, and it's quite awkward to have two arrows without Go Again in your arsenal at the same time. You basically have to commit your Snapdragons to get them out of there. So that's one tip, is just try to save Codex for a situation where your arsenal's empty, you get an arrow back, you fire it, and then you have just like a completely open arsenal to ponder, draw an arrow, and set it. Um, but yeah, so basically you are looking to play Codex at the end of the chain. Oftentimes you can do tricky stuff with it, like you mentioned earlier with the drill shot. Like if you can get your opponent to block out some, um, you can get back an arrow. Like maybe they only have two cards left in hand. You make them get an attack action back from Arsenal and discard one of their cards, so now they only have 3 block left, and you can just go get the nastiest on hit in your graveyard, and they're forced to take it. Codex is, of course, one of the strongest cards in the deck. It and Three of a Kind and Rain Razors are like the crazy power cards.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, talk to me about this one Codex of Inertia. I did see some lists on the weekend playing 3 Codex of Inertia. Is it specifically for the mirror? Like, what is the use case of this one up here?
So it's a card that I want to explore more. I think that it is, in general, like a potentially very strong card, just like Codex of Frailty. Like it can just be a 2-for-1. But the main reason I put it in the list is just to be able to create the inertia token versus Oldhim. If they are trying to fatigue, or if they're just playing a more defensive strategy in general, a lot of times you can kind of prank them with the inertia where they aren't able to use the card that you force into their arsenal, and they end up just losing it for no value. And then even if they are able to use their whole hand defensively, you get them off of an arsenal for next turn, so they can't Crown of Seeds, and then you can leak more damage the following turn. So yeah, for me, it's mostly for Oldhim.
Yeah, I think that's sort of a core concept against a more defensive deck like Oldhim, is that if you're playing an aggro against Oldhim, generally you're looking to create windows, and those windows are when Oldhim is tempoed off of the arsenal specifically, can't do something like Tunic, Crown of Seeds, get the additional card in hand to block. Those seem to be the turns where you're able to leak more damage than usual against Oldhim, actually progress towards winning the game. Anyway, Brodie, I think that sort of wraps up the core deck. Let's go ahead and get into the sideboard here, which I'll read out. This is going to be 2 red Arctic Incarceration, 3 red Battering Bolt, 2 red Command and Conquer, 3 red Winter's Bite, 3 yellow Winter's Bite, and 1 Heart of Ice. Looking at this package, doesn't really feel like I'd want to be sitting on the other side against you playing the mirror. This is a lot of ice. Talk to me about when these cards come in and what the use cases are for each of them.
Yeah, so we'll start with Heart of Ice. That is basically just a tech card for Kano. Give you the second AB. The ability on it can be quite relevant to just, pitch one. Say if you're going to go off, you have to go off right now. Have resources left in your hand to deal with their combo. The Ice package, like we talked about, is for aggro decks. Oftentimes, if you bring it in, the Artivores are coming out, and it's mostly like for the Mirror, for Azalea, for Runeblades and Ninjas, just other like aggressive decks like that. And then the last 5 cards are the Popper Suite. The Battering Bolts right now for me are literally only for Dromai, just to have poppers. And then the CNCs are also for the Lexi Mirror. I think they're pretty strong there. And maybe some other decks. I'm undecided. But the main reasons they're in the deck are Lexi Mirror and Dromai as a popper.
And you've chosen the Command and Conquer over Down and Dirty specifically because it has the modality of being good in the Lexi Mirror as well as being a popper in Dromai. I do think a lot of people would look at something like Down and Dirty and say, okay, that's probably a better popper overall, just has a bit more utility, can be played in more situations, but Command and Conquer also being good in another matchup, which is going to be prevalent if you're playing this deck, is the reason why it's in the deck. Did we talk about Arctic Incarceration here as well? It just also
Yeah,
comes
I
in
can.
against the aggro matchup, I assume.
Yeah, it and the 6 winners bites come in against the aggro
Mm-hmm.
matchup. Arctic is particularly brutal. Like if you flip it with Lexi and give them a frostbite, and then you just keep choosing go again with Voltaire and shooting arrows at them, they're kind of locked in this situation where they either have to block with their whole hand to not get blown out by Arctic, or they have to try to keep 1 or 2 cards and just know that those cards are probably going to be forfeited. There are ways to kind of play through it as the opponent, but it can be quite difficult, and especially in the mirror and Arctic lock can be kind of hard to escape.
Yeah, and it really sucks to have a sink below in hand when that happens too. So the 0 for 4s can be pretty rough. All right, Brodie. So what are some key lines and ways to play the deck that people might not find immediately apparent when picking up this deck for the first time?
Yeah, so I think the thing I mentioned earlier about Codex is one thing to keep in mind. Like you want to try to, if you start your turn with an arrow in Arsenal and you have Codex in your hand, an arrow without go again, that is. Usually you don't want to play the Codex that turn. I think you want to clear that arrow out of your arsenal the Codex, and then end with it next turn so that you don't end up with this double arrow arsenal situation. I think that equipment use is one thing to talk about. We touched on the bullseye and the staffs earlier. Usually those are for a 3 of a kind turn, especially the bullseye. When you draw, you have extra cards in your hand that you can't use. And most of the time it looks something like, pitch your resource cards, fire 2 arrows with Voltaire. Often you'll have an arrow without go again in your arsenal already, so you want to fire that and Snapdragon it so that your arsenal is now empty and you can use Bullseye to finally fire a 4th arrow from your hand. Um, Also, just in general, on the subject of 3 of a kind turns, Bolton Shot is particularly strong on those turns. Um, it is actually probably the most crucial on hit. If you have a really full hand and you're not going to be able to load all of your arrows otherwise, Bolton Shot being able to reload is super key. And you want to just think in advance about sequencing your turn so that if your Bolton Shot hits, let's say that you have like a situation where you already have an arrow in arsenal, and then you kept a big hand with 3 of a kind, and you now have 4 red arrows in hand, including a Bolton Shot. Sequence so that no matter what, when your Bolton Shot hits, if you get the opportunity to reload, you'll still be able to load the rest of your arrows. And most of the time, the reason that the sequencing is so weird with this is Bullseye Bracers requires your arsenal to be empty. So I often find myself actually using the Bullseye on the Bolton Shot, especially in situations where I'm pretty confident it's going to hit. And then last thing I wanted to touch on with 3 of a kind turns is Quiver of Rustling Leaves. The main use for that card is if you play 3 of a kind and you don't draw as many arrows as you want, you kind of like brick on it. Um, Almost all of the non-arrow cards in the deck are resource cards, like yellows and blues. So most of the time it works out quite nicely if you draw like some winner's bites and you have no arrows, you can pitch those winner's bites to the quiver and take a look at the top and hopefully, put an arrow into arsenal and continue your turn.
Yep, we did see Matthew Fox activate that quiver of rustling leaves in his top 8 match, and then flipped a nice battering bolt right into the arsenal. Promptly ended the game. Sorry, just recounting. That was just very unlucky. Anyway, yeah, I mean that sounds great, Brodie. Like we talked about at the beginning of this video, I think that this is the best deck out there right now. Is it going to be the deck that takes on every single tournament? I don't think so. But if you're looking for sort of the most powerful, streamlined, aggressive deck that has the most well-rounded matchups, Lexi is that deck. I think almost bar none. Like you said, we could see the meta adjust to sort of try to hate Lexi out. But the thing is there's not a lot of decks to do that. There really isn't. We only saw one, in my opinion, at the Pro Tour that was really rough against this deck list specifically, and it was Tao Tao's Zuri deck. That deck also struggles from having a pretty bad matchup spread. It might be good into Lexi. It might be the one good deck that can really beat up in these Lexi decks, but it does not have good matchups in things like Oldhim, etc. So Lexi sort of the deck for Road to Nationals, the decks for the upcoming calling season, or the calling in Antwerp at least. So definitely check it out. And if you're not playing it, if you're not the one piloting Lexi deck, you're definitely gonna be playing against it. All right, to end here, Brodie, sort of post-Pro Tour, maybe looking at the calling Antwerp or the calling in Singapore coming up, are there any cards that you would change?
I think this Lexi deck is one of the hardest deck building puzzles I've ever seen in Fab, and I think there are a lot of cards you could play around with. Pathing Helix is one card that was in
Mm.
Andrew's deck that didn't make it into mine, but it was the number one card I was trying to find space for. I think it's a really strong arrow that serves a similar use to Bolt and Shot. Like on those three of a kind turns, you can reload and use your whole hand. I think maybe playing with more codexes, like you mentioned, some people are on like 3 Codex of Inertia. That's something I'd be curious to try. Um, I think you can also play with the blues more. Like I was pretty unsure about which blue arrows I wanted. I felt pretty solid about the ones I decided on, but I think you could definitely tweak that. Maybe play more headshots. The issue with headshot is if you flip it off of Heatseeker or get it off Ponder, it's awkward. But Lexi has, I believe, the biggest card pool in the game. There's a lot of options out there, so I would definitely encourage people to just try different things and keep messing with it because I definitely think the perfect 80 has not been found.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Brodie, for coming on. For those interested, Brodie is going to do an additional write-up with a deck tech and sort of sideboard guide, tips and tricks, everything you know to pick up the deck and start being successful. Immediately, your road to national season is going to do a write-up for us on the Arsenal Pass Patreon. So check that out if you're looking for an additional piece to pair with this. And again, Brodie, thank you so much for coming on Arsenal Pass. Congratulations on your top 8, and good luck in your future tournaments here.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks.